Hello, I'm Thomas Wilson, Music Director of the Chamber Orchestra of the Springs. And joining me here at First Christian Church is Dr. Zahari Metchkov, an absolutely first-rate pianist. And Zahari, your concerto by Gordon Jacob is actually sort of one of the centerpieces, I think, of this entire program. How did you choose this piece?
Well, Maestro, I'm glad to be here and playing with the orchestra yet for another concert. I remember you invited me last season to look for a concerto with a more positive outlook on things, and I'm familiar with some wonderful repertoire for strings and piano, but they tend to be of the more kind of a 20th century, later Russian tradition, Schnittke and Shostakovich, and while I think they're fantastic pieces, they didn't quite fit. So through the research, I stumbled on the Gordon Jacob, and I was kind of really surprised because first I wasn't personally familiar with the composer. Now I know that wind players are far more likely to play Gordon Jacob before, and it was just so thrilling to hear what to me was new music, with kind of a new harmonic language, something very fresh, and I thought it fit that description of something energetic and positive, which probably is what we need.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I was really surprised at how little repertoire there is for even really almost on any instrument and just strings. Usually, and piano especially, there's so very little of it. And of course, that's our limitation this year with the pandemic, is, we're just mainly using string players, and we can't use winds and brass because of all the deep breathing. And so that was a real problem for us. And you really came across a very interesting piece.
I'm not quite sure why that is, because the genre, for instance, the piano quintet, which can be translated to a all-string orchestra and piano. Piano quintet is is a genre with lots of great pieces, but I don't quite understand. The strings are so versatile; they can sound like anything really, and the variety of articulations and dynamics they can produce is limitless almost. But composers out there, I mean,
right? It's a real hole in the repertoire. So I'm really fascinated by this piece, and so we're looking at 1927 here. And for any of those of you who have read Carol Oha's book, it's called Making Music Modern. It focuses on New York in the 20s and how this whole new business of modern music was really getting underway, and how New York was such a flashpoint for this. But London as well was going through a lot of the same process, trying to figure out what was going to be modern music. And so here's this wonderful concerto. And we listen to music from that time, even just, for example, the famous program with, it was the premiere of Rhapsody in Blue, and there was a bunch of other modern stuff there, and some of the other concerts that were happening at Carnegie Hall around the same time, same idea, just exploring new music. And we hear very up and down, ideas. It's like, what are we doing here? And yet, certain composers, I think, found a way to do something new and interesting and modern, and yet not necessarily send the audience running.
Absolutely.
And this piece sounds to me very much like that. What are your thoughts?
I think I generally like music from this general period because, for instance, 1926, just a year before, was, for instance, a huge year for Bartók keyboard writing. He wrote his first piano concerto, which I love very much, and kind of uses the piano in a new way. You can say somewhat percussive, but the orchestra is also extremely kind of imaginative use of instruments. Stravinsky Concerto for Piano in Winds, basically a known genre, almost, 1924. So in those mid kind of 20s, I think there was a great ability to produce fresh ideas of really high quality. And what I like about this piece is that I think it takes you through these kind of almost new worlds, you would say, but everything holds together very nicely. And just from purely pianistic point of view, we spend so much time playing thirds and sixths and octaves, and here it just seems like fourths and fifths, a far more important element, without creating necessarily kind of a jarring dissonance. You can see some pentatonic scales here and there, and you almost have to like relearn how to use your hands, because you know the kind of chords and spaces you're used to are just like, you know, 1/8 of an inch bigger. And it's just for a pianist point of view, is very interesting. There's some really cool ideas. The end of the second movement with that silent depression at the very last chord and letting it sound through. It's very, very nice. You see that in later 20th century piano music, but
and as I mentioned in rehearsal, I felt like the last movement feels to me like a sea shanty. You know, sort of a heavy 6/8, you know, it's sort of a modern version thereof, but it has that sort of 6/8 heavy sort of feel.
And it also seems to me like the largest movement in the piece, the most important movement. Well, you know, if you look at the classical type of concerto, usually the first movement is the heaviest, and then things get lighter, and the last movement is kind of quicker rondo. But here, it just seems like the last movement is most robust and most adventurous as far as textures and cadences for the piano.
Yeah, you get a sense in a lot of concertos, they have this brilliant idea that gets them started, and they exhaust this idea in the first movement, and they often have a pretty big finish in the first movement. It's like, where are we going to go from here? Yet the first movement sort of ends diminutive, you know, and the second movement, you know, doesn't try to knock you out. It's just really pure music and really haunting, in my opinion. And then this robust, you know, sea shanty kind of last movement, and this gives him an opportunity to have some really big romantic sort of outbursts. It feels like a romantic concerto in a lot of places there.
Right.
And yet it is thoroughly modern. So I really like it. And so we're looking at 1927 for this. And we have another program, also London, 1928. Eugene Goossens, we have another piece on the program, his Concertino for strings. And so these pieces are almost cousins in a way. And you hear a lot of the same things. You hear a lot of hinting at chordal harmony, using modes, you know. It's really fascinating. They were definitely speaking to each other through their music back then. And Eugene Goossens, I think, previously people had remembered him more as a conductor. And yet his compositions are now getting played, and they're fantastic. So this has been a real interesting experiment for us. It's definitely a very challenging piece. And rounding out the program, just as promised, we've been doing the 3 Mozart divertimenti that are called his Salzburg symphonies. We did one at the very beginning of the season, one in the middle, and now the last one. So we brought you all 3 as promised. And a little composition from 1892 by Joseph Suk. Now, this is not a household name, but he was a brilliant composer, wonderful composer, and he just happened to be a student of Dvorak, and so special to Dvorak that he married Dvorak's daughter. And so it's really a lovely piece, and it just has this youthful energy to it. He was still very young when he wrote it. And it's just so delightful, so melodic, and yet a fantastic ending. And I've been mentioning to the orchestra that the second movement is a waltz, but sort of a crazy waltz in a way. And it feels, we think about Symphonie Fantastique, and we have the waltz movement, the second movement in Symphonie Fantastique. And it feels sort of like, you know, in the story, the protagonist, he's brokenhearted, and he takes drugs, and he thinks he's going to die, and he has all these visions, including this sort of crazy, sort of debutante ball kind of thing. That's that second movement. It feels sort of like that, just not quite as rough as drugs. Maybe a little too much champagne, and it's a little bit silly and a little bit fun. But just like he does, just like Dvorak does, right before the end of the cello concerto, right before the end of the New World Symphony. He has this beautiful moment where all the harmony goes so simple, and you hear these horn fifths, and which you know, that's like the very old school style, you know, the old brass instruments when they couldn't play those sevenths, and so they would have to do a horn fifth instead, and you just have to hear that seventh in there. And so the harmony goes so simple right before the end, and then still a very energetic, very exciting end. A great way to end our season. You know, again, just strings, but if I had to choose one piece to end the season with, this is definitely it. So Zahari, it's been a real privilege doing this concerto with you. I thank you because we had talked about doing a concerto at some point, and we had several pieces on the table. But when we had to reprogram everything, you know, we reprogrammed the fall first, just to see how things would work out. Would the pandemic end in time? And I think it was somewhere in the fall it became clear, no, we're in for another, you know, 6 months or so. And so that's when I contacted you, and you were so gracious about doing some research, and you found an amazing piece that I think speaks to you, certainly speaks to me as well. And it's just such a wonderful piece. So thank you for doing that. And you had to learn it very quickly.
And I thank you and the orchestra for having the fortitude and being able to continue to make music in this really, really strange time for people, and especially for the arts. It's fantastic. It's a real service to the community and to the players and to music to continue to make art in kind of a safe environment, a contained but safe environment, and it's just a pleasure to be able to work with the orchestra here again.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
And thank you to everyone in the community. You've made this possible. A lot of orchestras didn't do so well during the pandemic, but we've managed to keep things going, to keep serving our community. Every single musician stayed on staff. There were no pay cuts. We've gotten through this in fine style. We couldn't have done it without you. So as we're, you know, this is really the season finale for us. We have a lot of gratitude for everyone in the community for everything you've done. I also want to thank our musicians, even our wind and brass players who just stayed home all season. You know, we know they're very excited to come back and to be playing again, but our string players, of course, turned out and played, and you know, it's easier if you're scared about everything. It's easier just to stay home. But they did it. They showed up. They put on the masks. They did the distancing, which makes rehearsals a lot harder. But we did it. We did it, and we did it in fine style. And I'm really proud. I'm so proud of this organization this season. I couldn't be more proud of what we did. But we couldn't have done it without all of you. So thank you very much. Be looking for a couple of special events over the summer. We're already cooking up some things, maybe even a return of the winds for a special event. And so be looking for that, and we're really very excited. Thank you very much to all of you, and we hope you enjoy this last program of our main season.